title, so it isn't just a professor, is actually the let me get this right, the Oscar Niedermeyer Professor of Architecture. I hope I said that right, Rachel. And she leads the School of Architecture and Design. But I think she's one of those people that we would all aspire to be, in so much as not only is she an expert in her research subject area of architecture, she's also making sure that translates across into amazing teaching. And to prove that, she was awarded the top prize, the National Teaching Fellowship last year, for her work supporting not only just architecture education, diversity in architecture education, so another issue close to many of our hearts. And that was due to her inclusion of live projects, development of civic agency, and critical engagement in learning and cultivating more inclusive models of education, particularly underpinned by feminist pedagogy. Not being rude, but she's been around a while, been teaching for over 20 years, following taking her PhD up north in Sheffield, and recently published a number of amazing books, Architecture Students Handbook, and has really had a significant impact on architecture education over the past few years via her association with the Architecture Education Association, and has really kind of led on the architecture pedagogy. So not only, as I say, pushing the boundaries of architecture, she's taking everybody with her, which I think is something to be commended. So I'm going to hand over now to Rachel, who's going to give us a fantastic talk this morning, and we will, I'm sure, learn a lot more about architecture than we knew before. So over to you, Rachel.
Thanks so much, Maxine. Wow, what a lovely introduction. And just to reinforce that we hope to record this, well, we are recording this and are going to put it onto the website afterwards. So just, I hope everybody is happy with that. I'm going to try and share my screen now. Hope that all works. And I need to... Can I just confirm that you're seeing that okay?
Yeah, we can see it, Rachel.
Yep. Thanks. Okay, great. So as Maxine said, I'm Rachel Sara, and I don't know how you pronounce my title either. I assume it's Oscar Niedermeyer Professor of Architecture. I haven't met Oscar Niedermeyer, unfortunately, at the Birmingham School of Architecture at Birmingham City University. And I'm going to be talking on educating the creative practitioner. And in this lecture, really reflecting on the past, present and future of creative education, its role as civic agent of change in the city, and indeed in responding to the most pressing problems of our time. So I've been involved in the education of architects for around 20 years, as Maxine said, and just in August 2020, I was really so honoured to be awarded the prestigious National Teaching Fellowship. So in those 20 years, I've witnessed and have been part of really a significant shift in the way in which design is taught. This shift has been characterised by a move away from isolated, individually focused ivory tower of the studio environment to more involvement with community engagement, collaborative, living laboratory models. So the images you can see on the screen are from my colleague Matthew Armitt, and just give that impression of creative education both changing and remaining constant over time and geographic location. So the image on the left was recreated with our students at BCU in 2019, and the image on the right is from the early 1920s and is tutors discussing with students during the space course at the Viktemas in Russia. So my plan is to discuss creative education, firstly from the perspective of a passionate advocate. I'll begin by discussing the strengths of creative education and then reflect on some of the changes of the last 20 years, really begin a critique of some of our practices and what has and what still needs to change, and then aim to position the opportunities for creative education to be a civic agent of change. I'll introduce a range of examples in which students have engaged with community organisation to participate in making places with these groups. And really, my aim to argue that this is this participatory approach to education shifts the focus and the model of creativity from that idea of the individual genius to the idea of collective wisdom. So finally, I'm going to question the primary focus of education as provider of practice-ready graduates. Our civic responsibility is so much bigger than that, and instead try to make the case for an activist education that has transformative potential to collectively build a better world. we need it. So I'm going to start really with that idea of a love letter to creative education, and really start by making the case that creative education is amazing. And I really believe that everybody should be given the opportunity to have a creative education, that everyone, no matter what their ultimate profession, would actually hugely benefit from it. A recent article by Robert Sternberg in The New Scientist suggests that the way in which current mainstream society defines intelligence actually exacerbates world problems and needs a radical overhaul. If you think about it, the approaches that we have to measure IQ, university entrance exams, and almost all academic qualifications are based on a very specific model of intelligence, and a very specific model of education, we might argue. And that is centred on mainly information recall and analytical skills. But the kinds of real world problems that we're facing today, we know what they are, think perhaps climate change, even the current pandemic, are often emotive, they're context driven, they're difficult to even define as a problem, they lack single correct answers, and so on. And so Robert Sternberg in this article suggests that we need a mixture of creative, analytical, practical, and wisdom-based skills, which he defines as an adaptive intelligence, that I would define actually as a creative intelligence. And I would argue that we have a model of education which supports this alternative, much more valuable form of intelligence, and it's the education in the creative disciplines. It's what we do. This includes architecture, interior landscape, art and design, product design, fashion, engineering, and so on. So the images on the screen here are from my teaching in 2018 at my previous post at the University of the West of England, an image from the Birmingham School of Architecture's Technical College days in the 1960s. And these terms, the ideas of creative, analytical, practical, and wisdom-based skills that Robert Sternberg outlined as so fundamental to a new kind of intelligence, or at least a valuing of a new kind of intelligence. So it's really noticeable as well that in Bloom's taxonomy, which is one of the best known theories in education to classify learning according to the level of complexity, the later versions of this position create at the very top of the hierarchy. So creative education is important and wonderful. As educators of creative practitioners, we've ourselves creatively developed a range of activities, processes, attitudes, and events. And these uniquely develop these creative, analytical, practical, and wisdom-based skills and knowledge. But we've perhaps not celebrated these as much as we should have done. Our own innovations are so obvious to us that we forget how innovative we have been and how transferable and indeed important the skills we develop are. We need to do more to shout about our activities. Suddenly, business schools, governments and industries are talking about the importance of creativity and business across industry and society. We should be at the forefront of supporting people to unlock this creativity, as we've the techniques and the expertise to make this happen. Creative education is wonderful. Let's shout about it. So we've developed special places in which to learn and practice. The design studio is really at the heart of a lot of creative education and is a place but is also a practice and an educational model. The design studio, they're spaces where the knowledges and skills that are developed in other parts of the course can be brought together. So we're really helping to develop skills in applying and synthesizing knowledge to develop something new. They're places and practices. The design studio is a place and a practice. So students might ask, what are we going to do in studio tomorrow? And they're not talking about the place. It's also a culture, a way of being. And there are strengths and weaknesses in that. New education models of problem-based, practice-based, active, collaborative learning, they're not new to us. They're embedded as part of studio culture. They're part of our everyday practices. And they are, again, characterised by those qualities of creativity, analysis, practical activity, and wisdom. Remember those keywords for a more useful kind of intelligence. So we've developed, as well as different spaces, we've developed alternative forms of assessment and evaluation. And these are typified by design crits, reviews, or juries. So for those that don't know, the crit or design review is really a unique feature of creative education. In its 20th and 21st century format, it typically involves an individual or sometimes group of students standing to verbally present their design ideas against a backdrop of visual and tactile work. This might include drawings, models, film footage, and so on. So typically the student will present their work to a panel, which might include expert critics, relevant practitioners and academics, and other students. And it's typically held in sequence with other students' presentations, so there's an opportunity for comparison and also therefore competition, alongside a potential for the work to be viewed as a collective exploration of a particular set of themes that might have been set in the studio. It's often used as both the point of an evaluation or assessment, as well as an opportunity for, well, ideally constructive feedback and critique, with the intention of developing, progressing, and improving creative work. Again, those skills that we talked about as being so important, creativity, analysis, practice, and wisdom, can be shared, they can be interrogated, further developed and celebrated, most importantly and openly with students. Again, ideas of involving students in their assessment processes and involving dialogue and debate as forms of knowledge interrogation and generation aren't new to us. But it's therefore much more than a place in which work is evaluated. It's fundamentally a creative place of knowledge generation with potential for knowledge generation and critique and transformation. So the practices developed designerly ways of knowing, the concept developed by Nigel Cross that designers, whether architects, engineers, product designers and so on, have and use particularly designerly ways of knowing and thinking. Again, it could be that designerly ways of knowing are these creative, analytical, practical and wisdom-based skills and knowledge, and I would certainly like to make that case. An extraordinary quality of this way of knowing or even being is that we're educating people to conjure up ideas that simply did not exist before. This education for invention and solution finding is arguably just what we need to respond to the complex real world problems that we're facing, climate crisis, COVID and beyond. So, for example, piece of work on the left of your screen by Lauren Francis is currently exploring how we can repurpose our high streets to locally clean our sewage and grey water waste and introduce beautiful waterways into our cities to improve well-being, reduce carbon and increase biodiversity. Or on the right, the exploration of Byron Chan, who last year was highly commended in a National Sustainable Architecture Award, who investigated how we can make building facades that are more permeable to wildlife so that our cities can cease to be deserts and instead be havens of biodiversity. Increasingly important as other land gets eaten up by agriculture. Product and furniture design graduate Hans Ramzan, who won both Product Design of the Year and Design Project of the Year at the prestigious Design Awards in 2020. This is this Project Catch, which is a low-cost, easy-to-use self-testing device which detects HIV, allowing people in developing countries with limited access to medical support to check themselves for HIV at home. We need to get on him to do the new rapid COVID tests. So our techniques and attitudes are useful. They're all useful, I would argue, to all disciplines. We need to share them. I just go back and say that I really think that the techniques that we have at the heart of creative education are fundamental to this kind of new kind of knowledge. So that was my kind of, I suppose, love letter to the creative education models. And I just want to reflect a little bit on the changes in the last 20 years. And some of that is really a critique, I suppose, of some of the problems that are also inherent in this wonderful form of education. So despite the really inspirational aspects of creative education for creative practitioners, there are some problematic elements. This is what I looked like when I started. This is what 20 years does to you. And whereas architecture education still really felt like it was modelled on this, this is Ayn Rand's Architects from the Fountainhead, the book and image from the film. And this architect is a male, white, ruthless architect who pursues architectural excellence as an individual, misunderstood genius, with no room for client or user needs, for compromise or collaboration. And that wonderful studio space that I celebrated earlier, it seems tended towards individual competition and isolation. You can almost spot the ivory tower in the picture. It also seems that the creative, innovative process that the design crit has the potential to be had become lost, drowned out by an atmosphere of attack and a defence, dominated by tutor and external critic voices, and exclusive. So no normal people from outside the discipline were involved. Because, of course, what happens when there's an attack is that the natural response is to mount an appropriate defence, not to engage in dialogue, and therefore lose the opportunity to develop knowledge. Various pieces of research around that time also identified that the model worked well for some, probably those largely white, male and well-to-do students from the past, but the system was failing to support more diverse range of students, particularly female students, that were now accessing higher education and design education in particular in greater numbers. So just after completing my own architectural studies, I embarked on a PhD and developed a feminist manifesto to rethink architectural education. This was awarded a prize from the European Association of Architecture Educators, which was nice. But I want to share it with you because it set out 21 points for change in schools of architecture. But I'm sure that they have relevance across the creative education disciplines. And I'll gallop through them, but a few will be most relevant to the argument that I'm setting out today. So I argued that the challenge should be to alter that crit or review process, that we should be working to develop communication and interpersonal skills into the design studio, to diminish the power of the tutor over the student, and to promote team working and cooperative learning. It's very much kind of encapsulated, I suppose, in the sculpture by Arturo Martini, which is shown on the screen, called Le Collegiale. I proposed that we should introduce others into the studio. So the image in the left, I suppose, takes the mickey out of this idea of, architects that have fallen into their own kind of cultural norms, famously wearing the black polo necks, but also there's a baby who's been named after Mies van der Rohe, called Mies, who's been put into a pushchair, which is designed after the very famous Rietveld chair design. And so by introducing others into the studio, we begin to get different voices and begin to change that, expand that cultural norm. And that's also part of prioritising an idea about inclusive design, design for everybody, regardless of ability. That we should be thinking about educating critical thinkers and developing criticality in our students, and allowing for a certain amount of self-responsibility in learning so students can develop their own directions and paths in their educational route. I argued that we should be prioritising learning over teaching, valuing students' prior experiences, implementing interdisciplinary learning, still part of that idea of making connections to people outside of our discipline, and allowing, therefore, celebrating when students might move into other careers. The image here on the left, I suppose, is by the architectural cartoonist Hellman, and it really characterised, its caricatures, this idea of the student as an empty vessel being filled with the knowledge of their tutors. And I was really keen to kind of challenge this kind of idea, this patriarchal model. The next points were really about enabling critical reflections, thinking about valuing the process as well as the product. So the image behind the text is an image from one of my colleagues and PhD students from University of West of England, Matthew Hynam, who established a cut-up technique for cutting up models to consider them, review them in a different way. So the process of his practice was really important. To value the everyday, not just the elite, and to promote empathy as part of a design skill. Finally, the last kind of 5 points were that we should be working towards providing a nurturing environment, working to counter that myth of the genius, introduce context and contingency into our processes. It's so easy as a designer, as a design tutor, to simplify the complexity and contingency of real world problems, but actually kind of argued that there was a real value in bringing those into studio. Acknowledge the role of value and ethics in what we do, and finally study in spaces that reflect the pedagogy. I've just been involved in a further crit development workshops over in Dublin, and they've further developed ideas about roundtable reviews. And it's really interesting how just the change to literally having a roundtable changes the dynamic and the equality of everybody involved in the process. So I suppose it's important. It's important because the architecture as a profession is still not as diverse as it should be. And arguably the discrimination could be seen to begin in schools of architecture. Between a quarter and a third of respondents of this survey, actually, it varied according to the country, recorded that architectural education still favoured men. And both aspects, from practice and from schools of architecture, suggests that an architectural culture which is still entrenched within a masculine paradigm. And it's so frustrating. I remember the whole range of reports in the UK and elsewhere around the turn of the century, the Egan, Stansfield Smith and Cude projects in the UK, arguing that we needed to change the model, and yet here we are. Anyway, I digress from the focus on active change. So what have we done and what can we do? Firstly, that we alter or amend or further develop that crit or review process. So I co-authored this book, which began some of the debate, which is still going on today, again, almost 20 years ago since I wrote this, and set up some approaches to make the design crit more supportive, learning focused and nurturing model. It's interesting that this was a Twitter debate captured last year in 2020 that shows some of the problems are still very live. I don't know how much you can read of it, but note that Piers Taylor, host of the BBC's World's Most Extraordinary Homes, described, "I popped into a student review today, popped out again fairly quickly. Any chance we could rid architecture schools of middle-aged men bellowing at students how to design stuff? World might end up being a better place." And one Twitter respondent, Emily Haysom, says, "Perhaps you should teach the brutal architectural crit does not reflect the collaborative culture amongst the architects I've been privileged to work with." So various people then explain that, you know, that confrontational nature is why they left architecture school. So it's a recent Twitter storm from last year, and interesting that these debates are still being had. If you're unfamiliar with the process and you want to watch a funny, cringe-worthy film or want to begin a debate about the process, do watch this film. I was commissioned to begin to, I suppose, raise some of the issues around the review. I won't attempt to play it here, but it is worth a watch if you've got 10 minutes. And the intention is really for the films to be used to promote discussion and develop ground rules for use by both staff and students. But as I said, it's quite a funny and cringeworthy film. So American critical pedagogue and feminist Bell Hooks suggests that when considered in relation to the crit, this quote highlights the potential benefits of the process. So she says, as a classroom community, our capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, in hearing one another's voices, in recognising one another's presence. And I really like this just as a reminder for our educational processes to genuinely be affected by our interest in one another and our ability to hear one another's voices and recognise one another's presence. But Chantal Mouffe reminds us that this need not be without any conflict. She says the central task of democratic politics is to provide the institutions which will permit conflicts to take an agonistic form, where the opponents are not enemies but adversaries amongst whom exists a conflictual consensus. And this was the diagram that we developed as part of that CRIT book, which just clearly describes the learning potentials of different approaches. And really, I would say that it might be relevant to all learning events, that if we see an intersection between support and challenge, that actually where there's low support and low challenge, you might argue there's no interest, no energy, and no learning. But where there's high challenge, but low support, there's criticism is seen as attack, as we saw in the cartoon. And where there's high support but low challenge, perhaps we're all rubbing each other's backs. The effort is really concentrated in the support, and again we might argue that there's limited learning there. So the most promising space for learning is where there's high amounts of challenge but also high amounts of support. One approach that seems to respond to so many aspects of the manifesto, moving on, I suppose, from the idea of the CRIT, is also the introduction of projects that ask students to go out into the community and to work with real people to develop projects that respond to communities' needs. So in architecture, we call these live projects, but they're similar to living laboratories and even a concept of community-based learning identified by John Dewey back in the 19th century. So through this kind of engagement, students get the opportunity to develop some of those manifesto outlines, to develop their communication and interpersonal skills, to have more control over the project, so potentially to diminish the power of a tutor over the students. They promote team working and cooperative learning, and they definitely introduce others into the studio or actually take us outside of the studio. And they prioritise inclusive design because they're working with real people and real scenarios. So I would argue then that creative education is most powerful when it connects beyond the university. And I'd like to think a little bit about the idea, therefore, of our action as universities as civic agents of change. So I'd like to make this case for student learning to be connected to society. Universities as quasi-public agents, I argue, have a civic responsibility towards the cities and the communities of which they are a part. And the ambition to make a positive contribution to society is on most universities' mission statements. Increasingly, this contribution is conceived of in relation to the local community as well as wider society as a whole. In perhaps the typical model, local engagement is done through outreach and engagement. And those activities aim to share and apply the expertise and knowledge generated by the university. They share them with communities. So that model is generally conceived as a one-direction path from universities to communities, in which communities are the passive recipients. However, the principles of civic agency identify the potential for the engagement to take on much more of a two-way collaboration. So in this, there's much more of a transformative intent to enact positive change, and where both the new knowledge and understandings that are generated in a collaborative process are generated by and shared with that civic society. So this is increasingly being seen as fundamental to sustainable cities. The UN's part of the UN's New Urban Agenda identifies the aim to work towards cities that are participatory, that promote civic engagement, that engender a sense of belonging and ownership amongst their inhabitants. So live projects or living laboratories can be reflected on as a new model of university engagement in the city, and that these models aim to draw on the resources and expertise of the university to facilitate collaborative and participatory civic engagement projects. The intention is that through action-based design projects, community members, academics, students and experts can engage in processes which enable all participants to generate and share knowledge, develop skills and fundamentally to transform our world. At the Birmingham School of Architecture and Design, we've got a great tradition in this. This image is considered to be one of the first live projects in architecture in the country. It's described as a conglomerate build from 1961. So we think it's from Margaret Street time, but it was an off-site design and build project. Live projects or living laboratory projects shift the location of learning from that idea of the ivory tower of the university spaces to public places which connect with communities. So this image shows a workshop that BCU architecture staff and students ran in collaboration with a local school in 1996. And this approach challenges the myth that creativity is just for the gifted few. This quote from 1972 by the architect and educator Simon Nicholson sets out that creativity is for the gifted few. The rest of us are compelled to live in environments constructed by the gifted few, listen to the gifted few's music, use gifted few's inventions and art, and read poems, fantasies and plays by the gifted few. This is what our education and culture conditions us to believe, and this is a culturally induced and perpetuated lie. So involvement in others from outside of the institution blows apart this lie and opens up possibilities for co-constructed knowledge and participatory co-design processes. Projects that I've been involved in that bring this kind of live project focus into universities are Hands on Bristol from the University of West of England and CoLab, Collaborative Laboratory here at BCU. The projects really bring together community members, architects, trainee architects and academics to work together. And the idea is that they will work together to generate outcomes that make positive changes within and beyond the city. So these projects typically involve processes of co-creation, so in which student engagement helps catalyse possibilities that often couldn't otherwise be unlocked, perhaps because the groups don't have any budget or simply they don't have the time and the energy to get ideas off the ground. They position the idea that successful creative work is about collaboration as much as about the individual genius. And we're really inspired by the idea of creative practice as a form of agency, spatial agency in the case of architecture. The idea that we can use education projects, in this case architecture, to make changes in the world. And we're inspired by the tradition of practices like MUF and of course Turner Prize winners Assemble, a collective who work across the fields of art, design and architecture to create projects in tandem with the communities who use and inhabit them. And the principle of civic agency is that we're working with community groups, not for community groups. This is connected to what David Harvey describes as the right to the city. Harvey argues that the right to the city is far more than a right of individual or group access to the resources that the city embodies. It's a right to change and reinvent the city more after our heart's desire. The projects I've been involved in see live project education as a form of civic spatial agency. So this civic spatial agency involves a community or not-for-profit organisation in collaborating with architects and architecture students to co-create brief, timescale, budget, product and process for their mutual benefit, with the intention of making a positive impact in these communities. Projects shift the emphasis away from the notion of the architect as the sovereign expert to the practice of creative consultation, participatory placemaking practices and co-creation for knowledge generation, while also making explicit the community activist potential for architectural practice. So just going to talk you through one example of a project that ran over a period of time in Bedminster, Bristol. So we began by undertaking activities in community events within the area, and took that exhibition out onto the street, as you can see, a portable exhibition space. We did activities that asked members of the public to give us ideas. One of the most wonderful ones was this idea that we should do things that make life more absurd. Based on this, we set up, so I say we, this is a group of architecture students and academics, set up a gallery on the high street with this intention to make life more absurd, and did a series of activities, public painting events that brought colour to that high street and activity. Sort of through this kind of long, slow process, it probably went over a period of 5 years of different engagement at different points. This particular little gap was made, we were made aware of as a space that the members of the community were really keen to do something about. It had been locked, and it started to be just used as a place to store rubbish. A builder who was doing some work just behind us in the photograph had started to store his junk there and bits of building works and so on. And so the process began with just, I suppose, making people aware of the space and beginning a discussion about what people might like to do with it, including this kind of idea of prayer flags, which were strung up by the space to record people's dreams for what might happen within it. And ultimately, this began a process of creative engagement that led to students developing this idea of this space being opened up as a storytelling space, which kind of kept its quiet and tucked away quality, and wouldn't disturb some of the residents that live in the sheltered housing behind, but would nonetheless open up the space to users. And so these were some of the images that the students generated, which is very much part of the parcel of what architecture students do. But the next phase, I suppose, was more interesting and unusual in the sense that they began to work with local groups to campaign to get the space opened up. And actually, one of the people that we work with put in a funding bid to get the project funded by a Pocket Parks initiative. So after a long and really quite difficult negotiation process with the landowners, we eventually, and I think the students were amazing in their involvement in this, but we eventually negotiated opening the space and invited people to come on in and help us just to clear the space. We also worked with a fabricator, local fabricator, who began to mock up some elements of the Pocket Park, of these ideas of the storytelling bench. And we had a half-scale model that we put onto site, and we just invited members of the public to come and clear the site with us. So this was one of those days. People come and just have a look at what was behind there. And as I said, also that builder, once he'd heard that we were going to open up the space, had very nicely cleared all his stuff out as well. So it kind of opened it all up. And the nice thing about this half-scale model was that it turned out to be exactly the right size for a child's bench. And so the storytelling bench seemed to work really well in that context. And actually, this bench was donated to a local school that sits in their library now, because it was just a mock-up model, really. Ultimately, the park was opened. It was opened entirely with an event entirely run by volunteers. Cake's always important if you want to get community involvement. And this wonderful storyteller volunteered her time to open the park with a story. And a busker also came and played music in the space. And what's maybe most interesting was that we decided not to, there were no formal structures for the management of the space. We just kind of appointed people, as we call them, Ebenezer Angels. The park was called Ebenezer Gate. So we appointed local people who lived nearby to be key holders for the space so that they could shut the gates if necessary. And therefore it's really taken on a life of its own. And so it's got its own Facebook page, and volunteers come from different groups, come and do different kinds of projects there. And it's really become a kind of amazing space that I think they've registered. There's lots of gigs that happen there. There's one of these pocket libraries. It also won some won some awards for student projects. So it really took on a kind of a life of its own in a quite lovely way. So along with my colleague Matthew Jones, who was also involved in that project, here at BCU we began to analyse this kind of process, this kind of approach, and we identified a range of civic agency concepts. Really, that analysis suggested that the projects fulfil key civic agency criteria, and these are that you should involve the citizen as co-creator, that you need to engage with public and community places, you need to reconceptualise the role of the professional and understand democracy as lived and cultural experience grounded in everyday life. So we make the argument in that paper that although the example is for architectural courses that can be used to generate civic collaborations, but the lessons are really broadly transferable. So the principle of involving citizens and co-creators, engaging with public and community places, reconceptualising the role of professional and so on. These really enable students to develop a range of skills beyond those found in typical academic work, and in particular those that are hard to simulate within the architectural setting. So particularly ideas about collaboration, peer learning, negotiating, communicating and professionalism. And these elements are of value to students, but also enact this idea of education as a form of civic agency. So, you know, this kind of work, in our view, is a win-win-win. The thing I love most is the idea that work that would otherwise be undertaken for purely academic purposes can actually be undertaken to make a difference in the world. So the approach demonstrates a shift from sharing knowledge that's created within the university to collaboratively creating knowledge in situ with communities. This also shifts the locus of education from its location within the academy to establishing learning community embedded in community places. In turn, this shifts the locus of power from being largely held by professional experts at a distance from those they work for to the empowerment of all participants in the process to be able to directly affect environments. And in this way, the approach can be seen as transformative, both for the participants and the city. Ultimately, the model's got the potential to change both the way in which we think about universities, as well as the way in which we think about cities. The city and the communities that constitute it become an agent of change for the university, just as much as the university is an agent of change for the city. So we shift from that conception of individual genius to collective creative wisdom. But this participatory approach to education questions that idea, the primary focus of education as provider of practice-ready graduates. I think this is really dangerous. As a colleague said in a meeting just this week, at the scale of the planet and the country, we're in such a bloody mess, for God's sake, we need something radical. She was right, of course. And who is there who is able to challenge existing practices? Who has an independent voice to be critical of the way things are currently done? Universities are uniquely positioned to be a critical voice. Who has the creative vision to see alternative futures? I argue that our creative students who we've educated to be able to critique existing conditions, see through the noise and develop innovative alternatives in response. We need this. We don't need solely practice-ready graduates. That's what training provides. We need creative free thinkers who are able to work collaboratively with all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds and specialisms to unlock powerful alternatives. This makes a place for the university as civic agent with transformative potential to co-create more sustainable, resilient communities, products and environments. And it doesn't even touch on the positive health, wealth and life enriching impact of graduating from a degree that has so little to do with whether or not graduates are practice ready. So I'd argue that we're uniquely positioned to ask the questions that others find difficult to ask. Education as civic agency is much more about developing creative practitioners who are able to work with others to critique, adapt, collaborate and generate innovative solutions in complex and messy real-world scenarios. This opens to the door to activism and the idea that we can change our world. We don't need to be passive recipients of knowledge. So, thinking about this idea of education as activism with civic responsibility, just a couple of examples that we're working on at the moment. So I run the Extinction Rebellion Architecture Studio in the Master of Architecture course, and we set up projects that are proactively trying to make restorative pieces of architecture that aren't just less bad, but somehow heal our environments. We have in the school the Environmental Sustainability Studio, which is an amazing piece of activism which promotes sustainable engagement amongst students. It's completely voluntary, it's outside of the talk courses, and has done things like these kind of activities which has got students to calculate their carbon footprint and to make pledges for how they're going to change their behaviours and how they're going to measure that. I refer here to the critical pedagogue Paulo Freire. He argued that there is no such thing as a neutral education process. Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate the integration of the younger into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity to it, which I might say is practice-ready graduates, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. As education, these processes are transformative. As action, this is activism. It gives students and the people they work with agency to transform their world. So creative education engaged in civic agency can be harnessed. Education which promotes creativity, analytical processes, practical engagement and experimentation, and let's also hope wisdom. Architectural critic and academic and thinker Jeremy Till describes, actually this is in the context of architecture, but I've just transformed it to the creative practitioner, that a move from the idea of a creative practitioner as expert problem solver to that of creative practitioner as citizen sense maker, a move for a reliance on the impulsive imagination of the lone genius to that of collaborative and ethical imagination. And I would argue that this encapsulates those skills of creative, analytical, practical, and even wisdom aspects that were considered to be so important in that New Scientist article. So finally, I would just make the case that we need to open the doors to the university so that we can co-create a radically better world. Thank you, and I'm going to try now to end my sharing of screen.
Thank you, Rachel. A really interesting and thought-provoking talk. So we're going to throw open now to any questions from colleagues. If people just want to pop their hand up, and then Rachel will ask you to speak.
Diane, I can see you have your hand up.
I do indeed. Rachel, first of all, that was absolutely fantastic, and you're quite right. I mean, it's transferable. I'm in media. I can see loads of kind of synergies and interesting kind of discussions we could have from this talk going forwards. But one thing that struck me was near the end where you talked about the focus on practice-ready graduates being a threat. And of course, it's the sort of language and metrics that we're, that's how we're tested, isn't it? We're have we done right by making our students ready for employment, which is how practice ready is usually interpreted. How do we, first of all, is that metric wrong? And what would you put in its place that allows us to argue that students can come and be employable? Because that's what the sort of shorthand for practice ready means, isn't it?
Yeah. Really difficult. Thank you.
Very welcome.
I think I suppose the thing that I think is so dangerous is the idea that we become servants to an idea of existing practice. And I think it really needs to be that we are actually provoking, challenging, questioning practice, and that we enable and give students the skills to be able to do that in their work environments. They need to be ahead of practice. They need to be at the cutting edge, and so that they can go into practices and say, in an architectural context, for example, we shouldn't be using this material, we should be using that. I'm not confident, I don't think we should use a steel frame, let's move it to a timber frame. And I know how we can develop the information, you can pass the information on to practices to be able to do that. So I think there's a couple of things. One is being sort of ahead of the game, and the other thing is to enable students to have the skills to be a critical voice in their environments, so that they can act with wisdom and so that they can act with ethics. And that's really, really difficult when you start out in a place and you've got very little, power. And actually, to some extent, I would say what happens to a lot of us is that we're not really able to enact the changes we want to see until maybe another 10 years or even 20 years later. But I think that's the point I mean. The focus, of course, I want my students to graduate as employable, but I want them to be, so much more than that, and focus on them just being employable, I think is the dangerous thing.
Perfect, thank you.
So I'm just, we might turn out to do this alphabetically. I've got Bouj, but Bugewa, have you got a question for me?
Yeah, really, really loved listening to you, because to me, what you were describing was, it was a masterful description of meaningful learning. And I just wondered, what do you think are the key points, based on what you've said? I looked at your manifesto, there were a number of points there: countering the genius myth, providing a nurturing environment. And also you talked about something else in another section of your talk on the culturally induced and perpetuated lie that creativity is brought about by a gifted few who have the gift for poetry or for whatever it is. And I looked at that, and I because my job is to help bridge or eliminate the success gaps at BCU. In particular, we know that there are success gaps based on deprivation, based on ethnicity, based on difference, basically disability, whatever it is. So your concepts, how can we use, what are the key concepts that we can use to help bridge that gap, particularly in your school, your Institute of Architecture, which has, I agree that your numbers are few, but there are gaps. So.
Yeah, thanks again for another challenging question. Firstly, I would say I don't in any way have all the answers. This is just some stuff that I've set out and some thoughts that I have. But I think there are certain principles. One of those is the principle of inclusive support. Another is the principle of, Bell Hooks's quote about just being open to listening, really, really open to acknowledging each other's presence. And to me, that, whilst it sounds like it's not very much that she's saying, the more I come to that quote, the more I get from it. I think it's really, hard to do the listening part, easy to do the telling part. So I think we need to listen, and I think we need to listen to our students and our colleagues, and hear their voices and try and understand their positions. And that is all about understanding the contexts in which they're all kind of working and learning, but to sort of understand it, but also give value to it. And I think that's something quite nice about some of these community engaged projects, that you can engage with environments that mean that you kind of that are beyond the experiences of, you know, the groups of people that you already have, and that takes one group of people into the experiences of another. So that really develops an empathy that I think is sort of fundamental. And then, you know, something I haven't spoken about at all, but I think is role models, and role models within the university, something that we need to be really proactive about, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, I'm just working my way down the list that I can see. So Hannah, I see you have your hand up. Hannah Vowles.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Hannah.
I hope you can hear me okay, everybody. Just to say how proud I am that you're part of our school and part of the university. It's absolutely wonderful. So thank you very much indeed. I've got a kind of a question, but I just want to respond a little bit to the question about employability. One of the really extraordinary things I've found when we do the consultations that are part of revalidating our courses, and we go out and talk to practitioners, most of them say that what they welcome most from our graduates is their ability to bring something else, to transform practice. And this has been particularly the case with our part-time students who are in practice, and they are working at the university at the same time as being in practice. And we have a module which facilitates a new relationship with the practice, where they take an element of the practice and they work with their colleagues there to see how they can bring value and change and innovation into the practice. And that has been immensely successful. And I recently have become very conscious that it's normal that got us where we are today. And I think we're all trying to reinvent normal. That's so no question, just a comment.
What can I say, Hannah?
Move on to the next one.
I agree, and thank you. That was really, and I really appreciate your nice, kind words as well. Fatima, you have your hand up.
Thank you ever so much, Rachel. Really, really enjoyed it. And I found a lot of similarities in my own area of work, in particular in terms of agent of change and co-creation of knowledge, which to me is actually partly having the confidence, wanting to take other people's with you and empower them. And I wonder, this is not a question, it's an observation, but could be a question. Is that again a gender issue? A different ways of thinking, different ways of working? And I'm saying this one because I often been told, why can't you make decision? Why, that would be much quicker. And why do you want, when you're in a team, to ask everybody's views about every small issues? And my response has always been, well, it's such a great joy when people, can run with you rather than you're running and others are, trying to catch up, because then people will take ownership because they have contributed, they have shaped it. So I don't know, I'm just putting this as an observation, and hopefully I will unpack that further when I'm giving my own talk next month.
Yeah, I mean, I agree in a sense, and it's always very difficult to say whether it's, you know, I'm always very nervous about the idea of a gender issue, but I certainly think that it is a culture issue and an issue around a masculinist kind of culture. So a way of a culture that was kind of largely model on kind of masculine approaches, and I suppose my thoughts are always that, you know, both men and women can act in that environment. And similarly, I think that you're right, there's a gender issue in the sense that we need to shift to a more feminist model, but that's not just about how women act, but how, you know, certainly I would like to act, but it's certainly about a kind of a rebalancing of a different way of practicing. That's my kind of thoughts on it anyway.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Katrina, did you have a question as well?
Yes, Rachel. So it was really some observations. And when you put up first the practice of the architectural crit, and I thought back to the days of the beginning of my career in planning departments and local authorities, when I had to conclude that the crit generated architects who were not capable, who were dysfunctional, and who were not able to participate in the sort of iterative process that negotiation and planning needed. And it was only those architects I found then that kind of shook off their education were actually able to work the system, you know, and be, especially where there were conservation issues involved. And, you know, sometimes those people, they need to kind of shake off their education. Whereas now I find, so say, let's move on 20, 25 years later, there are a lot more, the emergence of more collaborative architectural practices and better listening and better negotiation skills and everything. However, I do find, on the other hand, the architects seem to have less power, less ability to change things, and it's maybe perhaps more about the money and the investors and the pension funds. And so I would agree with you about the shift, and that's really welcome. Somebody who has to deal with architects a lot and is now teaching them. But on the other hand, they have lost, well, perhaps they've lost something. Maybe we all have, I don't know. That's it.
Yeah, really good point, and so difficult to fix. What do you think we should do?
I think the creative aspect being at the top of the pyramid is very true again, that I think people can still listen to creativity and radicalism, but it's to be able to come out with that, or to have the freedom of thought, to space to think and reflect, to be able to generate that kind of creativity. It's very challenging.
Yeah, no, I agree, and to some extent there's, you know, the ability to listen, but also the ability to make cases forcefully when you need to.
Yeah, that balance. Yeah,
and I agree.
Yeah. So it used to be you had to defend your design at all costs.
Yeah.
But now you do need to be able to change a little bit, but still get behind your kind of, your beliefs and stuff. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Katrina. I'm just reading some of the comments in the chat, and just Hannah Vowles has said, shared with everybody a lecture that's coming up, the role of public health in Birmingham in successfully combating the case of smallpox in the world in 1970s, illustrates the application of collective wisdom serving the whole community versus private gain, dominating the current pandemic. And no, that's not a lecture, sorry, that's an article that she's pointed out, I think. And then Esther Windsor says, I'd like to see protective strategies written into learning outcomes to allow professional practice to be proactive and creative and not to replicate existing practices and outdated principles. Love that idea, Esther, thank you. I'm just wondering if there are any other comments that are coming down as we look. Esther and Hannah says learning outcomes is a strange term that needs challenging itself. Thank you. Maxine, do you have would you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick question, Rachel. Just prompted by that mention of the smallpox there, and I'm as you know, I come from a biomedical science background, and it's all very well you creative types, you know, getting in a room together with you know, sticky back plastic and a bit of plasticine or whatever it is you do. But how can we take those critical ideas of not just kind of creating clones of ourselves that are going to step into science and do the same things again? How can we build that into a scientific education? I'm interested about, you mentioned a New Scientist article, which I haven't seen, that kind of fed into this, and I'll certainly want to see that, I think. But how can we do that? Because you're absolutely right, you want people to join the lab group and challenge things, to change things, not the fundamental nature of the work, unless they actually find something exciting, but that is how you make new discoveries, by not entirely accepting what you were taught at school or in your training. So how can we bring that into a very factual base where you have to learn how it all works in order to then, you know, push the boundaries? How can we bring that into a scientific education? I'd be really keen to see what you think.
Well, there are some principles that are quite transferable, I think, you know, quite easily. The key one about inviting others in, I guess inviting others into the lab. There's nothing like explaining to somebody what you're doing, and you know, even if you're having to explain something, you know, you're having to translate it into very simple terms, I suppose, to somebody who's non-expert. Sometimes some of the things that you're doing, you know, are exposed in a really interesting way. And so parallel to that, I think it's about taking students and academics, taking our science out and sharing it in some kind of public setting but I suppose it's really difficult to do that. If you're not careful, you'll get all the people who are experts in your field who come and join, and how you actually get that to a much more diverse group, I think is really an interesting challenge. I don't know how you would do it, but I think that would be something to do. And then the other thing that seems key is just something that I think universities are really good at, which is developing critical thinkers. And, you know, one of the skills is analysis. Perhaps that's overdone, but an analysis that brings in ethics and wisdom, and so that you can challenge approaches, make comparisons, I don't know, seem obvious things to me that could be transferable.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, the idea of the community, because I think certainly if you look at small children and you show them a few science principles, they're quite happy to get down in the dirt and come up with their own experiments on ideas. But somehow as they go through the education system, they somehow lose that. And that idea that you talked about at the very beginning about other people are the experts, other people are the ones who create the poetry and the music. Imagine that like a million times worse, but it's other people that do the science, other people that come up with the you know, those ideas, and somehow for many people that's seen as inaccessible, and that's a real problem, because those are absolutely the people that need to be involved in the science and who need to have that understanding, and particularly the current circumstances need to have that understanding so that they can critically analyze what's going on in a more constructive way. You know, as we're rolling out vaccines and we're seeing a lot of the kind of fake news around that kind of thing, that's because people don't have the skill set, they don't have the understanding to apply those ideas to it. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea.
Well, it also presumably, I mean, you know more about it than I do, but it gets picked up in citizen science projects to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely, but I'm not sure how much of that we do. Not enough, I'm sure.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, in my head, a citizen science project has some parallels with our kind of live projects, but I suppose that it tends to go out to quite an anonymous group, a citizen science project. Whereas I think one of the things that's really key with the projects that we tend to do is that it's not an anonymous group, it's a group that we really get to know over a period of time and engage with. And that's so important for the kind of empathy, wisdom aspects of the skills. Hannah has a really interesting point to say, which is that incorporating creative and critical thinking skills into STEM subjects is done more in other countries.
Can I come in there, please?
Yeah, sorry, absolutely.
I used to be a pharmacy academic, and one of the ways we did what Maxine is talking about was to have a pass-fail module, which was called Student Selected Components, and it enabled students every semester to come up with a question that they wanted to solve, a problem they wanted to solve, and go about solving it. And I remember one quite well where students, second-year students, decided that they were going to formulate a poly pill using 3D printing. And they were going to formulate this poly pill so that somebody with diabetes who has to have maybe 4 different medications will have one pill that they'll take and put everything in. And they went about creating it, demonstrating how to do 3D printing of a capsule and explaining the concept behind it, how it was going to support patient compliance and all of that. And this was their work. And then they had to write up a poster and they had to present it. And it was up to them to come up with the idea and bring about a solution. And because it was pass-fail and they were working in small groups of 5 or 6, it worked, and it allowed them to actually be creative and come up with whatever it is they wanted to do, but that was related to what they were studying. So that was just an example I wanted to give.
I'm quite a fan of pass-fail modules. We don't use them enough, do we? Because it takes some of the pressure of off, and especially if in a situation like this you're allowed to follow something that is your passion and your dream and your interest, then suddenly it's all about just creative engagement with that as a problem, rather than worrying about what those, somebody's used the word learning outcomes, might be, and how you're going to get that, 70+ mark. So I'm wondering, go in for it.
I also add something to what Maxine raised and very rightly to explain. We don't do enough. We don't do enough critical thinking or use the critical thinking in teaching. But like Maxine, I am also coming from the sort of science background, and I teach epidemiology. And I always say to a student, I'm not expecting you to become an epidemiologist by the end of this module, but what I'm expecting you is to be able to question epidemiologists, to be able to question the notion of how data has been created and constructed, and the vested interest in it. And then I suppose what I tend to do is I play that devil advocate role. From the beginning, I say, I am going to do that. I'm going to question a lot what you are saying, but not because I want to disagree or take your confidence away. That is the only way we can really learn how valid, how reliable, how representative the data we are utilizing is. So I think we do, but maybe we don't do enough. And to me, that is again parallel way of really using creative teaching.
Yeah, I kind of agree totally, and I think it's so easy as well for me to say these things that I think we should do. And when it comes down to it, we're all in the same position, aren't we? We're busy. We've got to do some teaching tomorrow. We don't find that we have the time to do a lot of the tasks that we want to do.
10 o'clock this morning.
I think some interesting things have come up in the chat about the kind of importance of collaboration, collaborative work, but also questions of confidence and how kind of building self-confidence in our students. And that's something I'm really fascinated about. And I'd love if anybody had any ideas about how techniques that they have for building confidence in their students. Diane's gone yellow.
Yes, it's not that I've got the answer, but it's more the issue that, I suppose what's progress is that we do acknowledge, how important is the huge part it plays in terms of, I'm sure Bugay's got kind of tomes on this, on a lot of issues to do with, how our students deal with in-class discussions and crits and all the rest of it, so we acknowledge it, that's good, but the amount of time we would need really to tackle it, I don't think there's a will to do it. You'd have to have it pretty much at the heart of, I've seen the query about learning outcomes, but, it would need to be sort of embedded, I would have thought, in pretty much everything we do, if you had a hope of trying to make sure that across the 3 years students normally with us, you were able to make huge inroads. And I can see that, you know, at least we're acknowledging it, that's great, but I'm not sure how much further we've gone. And I'd love to see that. I mean, I don't know whether those debates are taking place.
I don't know.
It's okay to come in there. I agree with what Diana said, but I think quite apart from even the pedagogy that we adopt, I think it's also important that students are trained in the sort of principles of equality, diversity, and inclusion, and understand their responsibilities under the Equality Act 2010 and human rights legislation, because what students fear the most is being looked at, you having funny looks because they've asked a certain question which people feel they should have known, or feeling that they're not able to contribute because they are othered. And that closes the mind. I often talk about the brain as being an invisible classroom. It closes the mind because of the fear, fight and fear, you know, the response where you have adrenaline.
Yeah, fight or flight.
Fight or flight response, that's what I'm trying to say. So I feel that it's important that students, all students, including the white students and the non-white students, are also educated in EDI principles, not just the staff, because students, the problem comes actually more from the interaction with their peers rather than the interaction with the teachers. And part of what we see in terms of the lack of success is because of what they're experiencing in the classroom. And I think that needs to be addressed through asking them or getting them to actually have face-to-face training rather than just the online modules, because the online modules are somewhat impersonal. I've done both, and I'm telling you, the more effective ones are when you are in front of, you are all together doing modules or looking at case studies on EDI matters, and then you understand that, my gosh, because you see what I've said and what I'll continue to say is that students are not innocent. Students are members of society, and they come in with their biases, whatever they believe, and this goes across the board. It's not just the staff, the students, and I think that needs to be addressed if you want students to work collaboratively and you want all students to be confident in class, because whether we like it or not, those biases seep into the classroom and affects those who are othered.
100%, totally agree. And if there's anything that this whole virtual teaching has taught us, it is how important it is to the face-to-face, the actual environment, but also acknowledging the social environment in which we are kind of working. And I think that's so important, and it seems to align with the idea of wisdom that is in this article, this New Scientist article. So I think it's just this week, Robert Sternberg. So 16th of Jan. The concept of wisdom to me is associated with that kind of social wisdom, that idea of ethics and how we work with each other and how we're all part of a group, and the kind of understandings that the biases that we come with. And I totally agree that we need to make those processes explicit as part of our teaching and learning in student groups. And I don't think we really do it with students at all. I think there was another really interesting point that came in the chat. I haven't followed it all, but Alessandro said, thinking about building confidence, that question of, is the genius myth the fact that it's based on the few or the privileged? Ken Robinson talked about finding the genius within everyone. It's the right environment of support that lets them thrive. You know, that's such a wonderful ambition that we would all have to help to find the genius within everyone. You know, I kind of really like that. But yeah, notwithstanding your point, Bigewa, about the kind of the social context in which you know, students are working and how that can be so much harder. I'm just having a look down the chat. Yeah, I don't have a link because it's not a digital article, but I will type into the chat the title and date of the New Scientist article, but it's not just on specifically wisdom. He talks about this for adaptive intelligence, having those 4 concepts of creativity, wisdom, I forgot what the other points were. I said them enough times, I should know.
I'm just sort of keeping it on the time. We're nearly out of time. So I wonder if there's any last questions for Rachel. I think we've had a really interesting discussion that's taken us in lots of different directions. And I think the idea of finding the genius in everyone is a lovely one to kind of be reaching as a conclusion. I think you've got one last question from Anita.
Hi, Rachel. Lovely, thoughtful presentation. And I think the questions have invoked quite a lot of thought as well. Just my thoughts really around, and I think I said this in the chat box, about mentors and how we as a university provide that environment for community and students. And I love the work of Sir Ken Robinson, and was obviously so saddened to hear of his demise. And I thought, what a wonderful and amazing character. But a lot of what he talks about is about invoking and inspiring at a young age. And I think by the time students get to us, do we really, and are we able to change and influence mindsets? And I'm sure we can, but Ken Robinson, of course, was talking about inspiring and spotting and working with primary children. And do we do enough of that as a university? And is that something that we should look at in terms of changing mindsets and appealing to individuals who may not even think, university is something that they will ever attain? And a lot, as Hannah said, some not perhaps a question in itself, but a lot of thoughts really. And how do we invoke those and inspire at a young age?
Yeah, I agree, Anita. And it's so frustrating, and particularly in creative education, that so much creative education is lost. We know how creative young children are. And it's really part of primary school education, and in secondary school it becomes, thinking about Bugewa's comments about, the environment and not wanting to look like an idiot when you ask a question or say something. I think creativity has been lost in so much secondary education, and is therefore not the thing that people want to kind of present. Again, I know it wasn't really a question, but the one thing that I would say is that when we do live projects and we work with different community groups, that includes schools, and we work with primary and secondary schools sometimes to do projects, again, with, not for. And that's always a very rewarding experience for our architecture students, because they love the kind of ideas, sometimes really unusual, out of the box, sideways ideas that working with children kind of can open up. And I think also it's exactly as you suggested. What's really nice is that it sets up a kind of an example of our students are just, a diverse range of young people, and shown that these people went to university, and so they get this kind of role model for the way in which they work and the futures that they might have. So I think there's a real benefit in basically taking education out of the ivory tower of the university and relocating it in all sorts of community environments to the benefit for all.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Anita.
Thanks, everyone. I think we may have kind of come naturally to the end of the questions there. I think there's a few bits in the chat bar. But can I just say thank you very much to the audience, and some really provoking questions and comments there that I think we'll all take back. And thank you in particular, obviously, to Rachel for a really thought-provoking talk. It has given us lots to stew on this Friday morning. And I think particularly how we take everything that you've presented, Rachel, and particularly what we've all discussed, and then think, and how on earth are we going to do that when all our students are sitting in their own rooms all over the place, rather than in those collective spaces where they can, challenge each other with their ideas. It's an extra layer of challenge, which I don't think we're going to solve today. But thank you so much, Rachel, for your fantastic talk. And thank you, everyone, for your attendance. Keep an eye out for the next of the Women's Words professorial lectures coming up very soon. I think Catherine Moore's our next one in a week or so. And we'll carry on repeating those with a couple each a month, hopefully, over the next few months. So keep an eye out. We are hoping also to set up a web page so that we can put the recordings on, so that if you've missed the talks that came previously that we have recorded, you'll be able to go back and view them again, which I think people will find useful. So keep an eye out for that. We'll post that out once we've got that set up. But just to finish off, thank you once again to Rachel for a fantastic talk. Well done.
Yeah, thanks, Maxine, and I look forward to Catherine's as well. Thanks, everybody.